Good evening, Berean. It's good to see you on this, our Lord's Day, as we gather again together as a fellowship to study the Word of the Lord together. I do want to greet those of you who are online and are joining us over the internet. It's good to have you with us as well this evening. Let's begin as normal with a review of the morning's message. This morning we began the 25th chapter of the book of Acts. And Paul is still in prison 2 years after the date of his first two trials in Caesarea under the governor Felix. So this morning we looked at his first trial under Festus. This morning I started with a brief overview of Festus, who he was. I talked a little bit about the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, because it's so clear here in the life of the Jewish people as God used bad governors to accomplish his intention of judging his people. And so we looked a little bit at the sovereignty and providence of God. Then we jumped right in and looked at Felix, the governor of the Roman province of Palestine. And he was a good governor as far as the Jews are concerned, and we went into that. He was beneficial to the Jewish people, although obviously not to the Apostle Paul. The chapter begins in verses 1 through 5 with the failure of the Jewish plot to kill Paul or ambush Paul. Festus comes into power in 59 AD. And after going to Caesarea, a few days later, he travels to Jerusalem. And when he goes to Jerusalem, the Jewish leadership accosts him and asks him to rule on the Paul case. They really want him to kill Paul, to execute capital punishment on him. But because Paul is in the Roman judicial system, that type of response is an impossibility. And Festus makes that clear in verse 2. And so the Jews decide to request a favor from him, a concession from him, our text says, in which he would send Paul to Jerusalem for trial. Now, we learn at the conclusion of verse 3 that his goal here was, the goal of the Jews was to ambush the escort bringing Paul to Jerusalem so they could kill Paul before he got to trial. Clearly, the Jews didn't think they had much of a case if they were trying to kill Paul before he got to Jerusalem. And so Festus does not agree to send Paul to Jerusalem. Instead, he invites the leadership up to Caesarea, and they would hold a trial in Caesarea. And that's verses 4 through 5. This is not a good situation for the Apostle Paul. This morning I talked a little bit about the idea that the people bringing the case as well as the judge are traveling together to the trial. And so this is not a positive situation for the Apostle Paul. And so that's how the opening section concludes. And then we went from the failure of the Jewish plot to the hearing before Festus. This is verses 6 through 12. And here we have the actual court case unfold. Festus and the influential men travel back to Caesarea. The next day, verse 7, Paul is called, and the Jews bring their case against the Apostle Paul. And they bring, as Luke says, many and serious charges against him. And then Paul, of course, defends himself, verse 8, as he had been doing up to this point. Now, Paul is cornered here in verses 7 through 9 because Festus, in verse 9, seeks to send the case to Jerusalem in order to hear the case there. Now, he promises Paul that he'll still be over the case, but Paul will now, he attempts to move the case from Caesarea to Jerusalem. This would be positive for the Jews, but it would be horrible for the Apostle Paul, because in Jerusalem, no doubt, the Sanhedrin would play a role in this particular case. And so Paul, verses 10 through 12, hears the offer, rejects the offer, and appeals to Caesar. He appeals to Caesar. Paul knows that the situation is not going to be a good one for him. If he leaves this place and goes to Jerusalem, he might as well kiss him goodbye. It's not going to benefit him. And so Paul makes an appeal to Caesar. What I did at the end of verse 12 is I gave you 4 principles on the use of one's citizenship in the role of a Christian. How can a Christian use their citizenship in a way that honors the Lord? And so I used Paul as an example of that and gave you 4 principles from this particular story that helps us to see how we can use our citizenship as Americans, although we're Christian. This led to the final section, verses 13 through 22. And here we have the appeal to King Agrippa. The story continues in verse 13 with Agrippa and his sister showing up in Caesarea. That's verse 13. Agrippa, I spent some time on him this morning. He was half Jewish. He was well respected by the Romans. He was considered the king of the Jews. He was the one who appointed the high priest every year. Agrippa had the responsibility for the temple in Jerusalem. So this was a man that Festus believed he could get some help with in order to figure out what was going on with the trial of Paul. As we went through this section, we saw how confused Festus was. Festus did not know Judaism well, nor did he know Christianity at all. And so his confusion led to him needing help in order to explain to Caesar why he was sending Paul, since he could not finish the legal case himself. And so in verses 14 through 21, Festus enlists King Agrippa's help. He gives the nature of the case, verses 14 through 16, how Paul became a prisoner, and as well as what the Jews wanted him to do with Paul. Then the nature of the charges, verses 17 through 19, and we saw that there were 2 charges that, as far as Festus was concerned, and one charge was the Jews and Christianity were fighting over the nature of their one religion. As far as Festus saw, when he looked at Christianity and Judaism, he saw one religion. And so he figured that they just have a disagreement on how they worship. He couldn't understand it. And then the second point that Festus said was they have a dispute over this man named Jesus. Everybody believed he died. Everybody believed he lived. Everybody believed he died. But Paul just happened to believe that he was alive, and the Jews did not. And that was the center of their disagreement, whether Jesus was actually alive or not. And then the nature of Festus's confusion, verses 20 through 21. He did not know how to rule in this case, and he needed help. And so he's hoping that King Agrippa will be of help to him, since he is partially Jewish. And King Agrippa, in verse 22, requests to hear Paul, which Festus agrees he will hear him tomorrow. And so that's where we concluded this morning. Any questions on the morning's message? Yes?
So was it the Pharisees and the Sadducees that were after Paul because of the resurrection, or just the Sadducees?
Probably just the Sadducees. Yeah, probably just the Sadducees. Yes.
If Festus was trying to do all that, it seems like a lot of this is being repeated. So what exactly, wasn't there a trial with Felix, and this is the second trial, or are these 2 trials different, or what's?
There were 2 trials with Felix. 2 two trials, at least two, that are recorded for us. Felix left the governorship of Palestine, and he left Paul in prison. So when Festus comes into power as governor, he has a prisoner already on hand. He goes to Jerusalem, and the Jews want him to take his prisoner and kill him. And of course, Festus can't do that because he doesn't know what the case is even about. And so that leads to another trial before Festus that we just looked at this morning. There's going to be another trial that when Paul presents the case in front of Festus and Agrippa. Well, Felix didn't do anything. He just left him in prison. We assume, yeah. But I mean, why didn't Felix release him, or kill him? One of the two. Yes. I do have one coming up in a future message, but just for the sake of discussion tonight, as I think of the providence of God, I'm thinking of the sovereign control of God, unseen by man, which directs human affairs. Yeah, I mean, these are the difficulties of life. When we think of the providence of God, we trust that God is in control of the events of our life, although we might not see his hand directly executing the issues that come to pass. The providence of God also deals with how God manipulates good and evil to accomplish his divine intention. How do you believe in the providence of God and keep from being disappointed with God? Well, I would say, I mean, at least part of this has to do with your embrace of the wisdom of God. You know, do you trust that God is a wise? Do you trust that God is a wise God? I have to say that when my wife passed away, I struggled mightily with trying to make sense of what had occurred. But it came to the point where I had to accept that God was in control of the circumstances of both of our lives. And although I might not have liked the outcome, I trusted that God's will was done. And so I believed in the goodness of God, the kindness of God, the mercy of God, the compassion of God. And so I wasn't disappointed with God because of who God is. Now, if I didn't know those other aspects of who God was, and all I knew was God brought about this event, I might be upset. But it's because we know the broader picture of who God is that enables us to withstand these type of events in our life that are disappointing, to say the least. But we have to ultimately trust that God's will be done, and that's what we ultimately pray for. There is the importance of praying for the will of God to happen, and if that's your honest prayer, then you have to embrace the providence of God. If your prayer is ultimately God's will is done, which we know God will always answer in the affirmative, then I have to trust, looking back at the circumstances, this is what God wanted. You can't imagine the thoughts that have gone through my mind as to what we could have done or should have done or might have done, or I mean, it's just sometimes it's an unending thing, and you have to at some point step back and say, no, this is what God wanted. Now I don't know why He wanted it, but it is what He wanted, and I have to accept His hand in my circumstances, and that He knows what's best for me. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that if all you had to go on was the providence of God without the rest of His character traits, I could see maybe ending up disappointed. But how can you be disappointed with a God who loves you? Well, that's a hard attitude to maintain very long, because at some point you are reminded of the kindness and mercy of God to you nonetheless.
Because it is exhilarating many times. It's like kind of a backwards and forward motion. Because you know all these great things will go on and get you excited, get you, you can see how stupendous things can happen and answer prayer. He can do miracles. Maybe He doesn't, but He doesn't do it. Then you kind of go emotional mode. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is the nature of life in the fallen world, and you have to accept. You have to accept that, these decisions and choices are God's to make, and so again, I would say, although I might have wanted the circumstances to work out differently, and saw those circumstances work out differently in other people's life, I didn't see them happen in my life. And that doesn't mean that God loves me any less. It does mean that God had a different pathway for me to walk. And at some point I have to accept His will. Not grudgingly accept His will, but I need to embrace that His intentions for me are what's best. Yeah. And yes, go ahead. Well, I would link the sovereignty and providence of God together. I do think there are different aspects of His will. Sovereignty deals with His basic control of all events of human history. Providence says something a little bit uniquer than just sovereignty, though. It says that God is driving events in a certain direction, that He's moving them in a certain direction, and of course that's part of sovereignty. But it's both sovereignty and providence are unseen. We don't see them. We see the results of them. We can look back. We can look back and see particularly the sovereign hand of God, because what happens is His will. And so neither of these are things we can see beforehand, however. Excuse me. Any other questions on the morning's message? These are difficult passages that we're dealing with. Very few ministers that I have read on the book of Acts have a good grasp of why. Pam asked about, this is the third trial. I mean, this is information that we're getting the third time. And so you ask yourself, well, why is it here? What is the edification I'm to receive from these trials? It gets even more challenging as we get on the boat with Paul. How am I to be edified by the boat and the crash? What's going on here? And there's a lot to see here. There is the providence of God. There is the sovereign hand of God. There is how a Christian faces issues that are sometimes very negative. I mean, Paul is now in jail for over 2 years. I mean, I would be bitter. But you don't get a picture of a bitter Paul here in his trials. In fact, we saw last week Paul joyfully gave his defense. We gain some insight here from the events in this latter part of the book of Acts that we might normally want to read past. I see your hand, I'll call you in just a moment. That we may want to just kind of read past and not kind of look into the life of the person experiencing them. But there's much for us to learn if we would be open to the life of Paul, the life of the Christian in difficult times, the life in the Christian when circumstances are not going in the direction they want them to go. There are lessons to be learned here if we would be open for learning them. And so as you look at these trials, as you look at the boat trip in a couple of chapters, let's kind of peer into the life of Paul. And I'm going to help you in some of the future messages. I'm going to kind of help you to peer a little bit deeper into Paul's life, to look at some things maybe you haven't looked at before. I'm going to tie some things together for you from the epistles to his life in the last part of the book of Acts. That should help you make some steps in maybe putting yourself in the shoes of Paul. And so maybe seeing some things about the Christian experience that maybe you haven't seen before. I hope that there are some lessons that we're going to learn from these last few chapters of Acts. Most commentaries and pastors spend a lot less time here than they do on the first part. And that's the same for us. I've preached more sermons from the first part of Acts, but I'm not going to skimp on you. I'm going to seek to draw out of this portion of Acts some things that we can benefit from as Christians on how to face these type of challenging circumstances in our own experience as believers. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that I think because of the convenient state that God has put us in here in this nation, that we probably can't see it the way that Christians say in Fox's Book of Martyrs. Christians going through the Inquisition would have read this, seeing that someone going through multiple trials like Paul and God remaining faithful to him, God continuing to be with him and comfort him, and him continuing to stay faithful through it all. I think they could more directly in line relate to it because they were going through similar circumstances.
Without a doubt. If you're a Christian nowadays living in a land where Christianity is illegal and you find yourself in the court system for your faith, these passages are going to ring especially true for you. However, I do grant that, and that's an excellent point that our brother brings up. I will say, however, that all Scripture being inspired and profitable means that there are some things in here for us, although we're not in prison. And so there are some truths that we can gain as well that will edify us, although we don't find ourselves, as our brother said, in a court trying to defend our sharing of the gospel with other people. But there are some things here yet for us as believers, and hopefully as we continue to go through these passages, you'll be edified by what we learn here. Any other questions or observations on the morning's message? All right. Let's transition then to our Bible study.